I started this project in early December, when the temperature was already dropping below freezing most nights. The plan was simple on paper: build a small off-grid cabin in a remote section of backcountry forest, test my skills, document the process, and prove to myself I could handle a real winter build. What I didn't account for was how quickly the cold would turn every small mistake into a survival problem, how exhaustion would compound every decision, and how close I would come to abandoning everything I'd worked for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you're watching this because you're interested in wilderness building, winter survival, or just the honest reality of what it takes to make shelter work in sub-zero conditions, go ahead and subscribe now, because I'm going to walk you through every mistake, every breakthrough, and the one completely unexpected feature that saved this entire project: the stone wall. I'll explain what it is, why I almost didn't build it, and how it became the only reason I made it through those frozen nights without abandoning this place entirely. The site I chose was about 8 miles from the nearest access road, up a ridgeline that caught steady wind from the northwest. I picked it because of a natural windbreak formed by mature spruce trees on 3 sides, a slight southern exposure for passive solar if I could capture it, and a small spring about 200 yards downhill that stayed unfrozen even in January. The first week was all about clearing brush, leveling the ground, and bringing in materials. I hauled everything on a sled: lumber, tools, a small wood stove I'd salvaged, roofing tin, bags of rock wool insulation, tarps, and enough food to last a month if I stretched it. The snow was already 6 inches deep when I started, and every morning I woke up to fresh powder covering my tarp shelter and tools. My hands were numb by 10 in the morning. My breath hung in the air so thick it felt like I was exhaling clouds. Every joint ached from the cold. But I kept moving because stopping meant freezing. The cabin design was modest: 12 by 14 feet, single room, a loft for sleeping, a wood stove in the center, 1 small window facing south. I framed it with rough-cut 2x4s, sheathed the exterior with plywood I'd brought in, and planned to stuff the walls with rock wool and seal everything with a vapor barrier. Simple, functional, and theoretically warm if I did it right. The first major problem came during framing. The ground was frozen solid, so I couldn't dig proper footings. I improvised with flat stones I scavenged from a nearby creek bed, stacking them under each corner post and leveling as best I could. The structure held, but it wasn't perfectly square, and that misalignment would haunt me later when I tried to fit the roof. The second problem was moisture. I didn't realize how much condensation would form inside the cabin once I started heating it. Every night, moisture from my breath, my cooking, and the snow I tracked in would condense on the cold interior walls and drip down. The rock wool insulation started getting damp, which killed its effectiveness, and I had no way to dry it out because the stove wasn't installed yet. I started sleeping in my tarp shelter outside, just to avoid the moisture trap I'd created. By the 3rd week, I was seriously questioning whether I could finish this before the real cold hit. The temperature at night was already down to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the forecast called for a cold snap that would push it below 0. My hands were cracked and bleeding from handling frozen wood. I'd bruised my ribs falling on ice while hauling stones. My food supplies were running lower than I'd planned, because I was burning more calories just staying warm. And the cabin still didn't have a functional stove, a proper door, or a finished roof. I sat outside one night staring at the half-built structure, and seriously considered packing up and hiking out. I'd already proven I could rough frame a shelter. Maybe that was enough. Maybe pushing through the winter was just stubborn pride. But something kept me there. Maybe it was the sunk cost of all that material I'd hauled in. Maybe it was the shame of quitting. Or maybe it was just the fact that I didn't have a better plan. So I stayed. The stone wall started as an afterthought, almost a mistake. I'd been gathering flat stones from the creek bed to use as a hearth pad under the stove, and I ended up with far more than I needed. These stones were dense, angular pieces of granite and schist, some as big as dinner plates, others the size of bricks. I'd stacked them outside the cabin under a tarp, and one morning I looked at the pile and had an idea that seemed half crazy at the time. What if I built a stone wall behind the stove, inside the cabin, as a heat reflector. I'd read somewhere that thermal mass could store and release heat slowly, evening out temperature swings, and I thought maybe a stone wall could capture radiant heat from the stove and give it back overnight. It seemed like a lot of work for uncertain benefit, but I had the stones, I had the time, and I needed something to do while the roof sealant cured. So I started building. The wall ended up being about 6 feet wide, 7 feet tall, and roughly 10 inches thick. I built it directly against the north wall of the cabin, creating a stone interior surface that ran floor to ceiling behind where the stove would sit. I didn't have proper mortar, so I used a mix of clay I dug from the creek bank, wood ash from my campfire, and a little Portland cement I'd brought for foundation work. The mixture was crude, but it held the stones together well enough. Each stone had to be fitted carefully, and the work was slow and cold. My fingers went numb constantly. I'd warm them by the fire, then go back to laying stones until they went numb again. The process took 3 full days. By the time I finished, I had a rough but solid stone wall that ran from the floor to just below the ceiling, backed up tight against the insulated north wall of the cabin. It looked strange. It took up valuable interior space. It added weight to a structure that was already marginal. And I had no idea if it would actually help. But I was committed now. I finished installing the stove, a small cast iron box with a 6-inch flue pipe that ran up through the roof, and positioned it about 18 inches in front of the stone wall. I sealed the roof properly, installed a makeshift door from scrap plywood, and stuffed every crack I could find with oakum and caulk. The cabin was far from perfect, but it was enclosed. That night, I lit the stove for the first time with dry kindling and small splits of spruce. The fire caught quickly, and within 20 minutes the stove was radiating heat. I sat on a stump I'd dragged inside and waited to see what would happen. At first, the heat felt good but fleeting. The cabin warmed up fast, maybe up to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, but I could feel drafts leaking in around the door and window. The walls, despite the insulation, felt cold to the touch, and I knew from experience that as soon as the fire died down, all that heat would vanish into the frozen night. I fed the stove steadily for 2 hours, keeping it hot, and then I noticed something. The stone wall behind the stove was warm. Not just warm, hot. I could hold my hand 6 inches from the stones and feel the radiant heat coming off them. The stones were absorbing the stove's heat and storing it. That first night was a test. I let the fire burn down to coals around 10 p.m. Yoon then banked it and went to sleep in the loft. The temperature outside was around 5 degrees Fahrenheit. I woke up at 2 in the morning expecting to be freezing, but the cabin was still noticeably warm, maybe 40 degrees. I climbed down and felt the stone wall. It was still radiating heat, hours after I'd stopped feeding the stove. I added a few more splits, got the fire going again, and went back to sleep. When I woke at dawn, the cabin was cold but not unbearable, and the stone wall was still faintly warm to the touch. It had worked. Not perfectly, but it had worked. The wall had stored enough heat to keep the cabin from plunging into freezing temperatures overnight, and that margin made all the difference. Over the next few days, I refined the system. I learned that the wall needed several hours of sustained heat to fully charge, meaning I had to keep the stove burning hot from late afternoon through evening. I learned that the wall worked best when the stove was positioned to radiate directly onto the stones, not just heat the air. I learned that the clay mortar between the stones also held heat, creating a continuous thermal mass rather than isolated pockets. And I learned that the wall acted as a windbreak inside the cabin, blocking drafts that would otherwise come through the north wall. That combination, thermal mass, radiant heat storage, and draft protection, turned the stone wall from a questionable experiment into the single most important feature of the cabin. Without it, I would have had to feed the stove constantly just to keep the temperature above freezing. With it, I could let the fire die down at night and still wake up in a livable space. But the stone wall didn't solve everything. In fact, the next 2 weeks brought a series of setbacks that nearly broke me. The first was a windstorm that hit 3 days after I got the stove working. The wind came out of the northwest, at what felt like 40 miles per hour, gusting even higher. It found every weakness in the cabin, gaps around the window, cracks in the door frame, loose sections of roofing tin that I hadn't sealed properly. The wind drove cold air into the cabin faster than the stove could heat it, and the drafts were so strong they interfered with the stove's draft, causing smoke to backdraft into the room. I spent half the night outside in the storm, nailing down loose tin and stuffing gaps with rags and oakum. My hands were so cold I could barely hold the hammer. Snow blew sideways into my face, stinging like needles. At one point, I slipped on the roof and nearly fell, catching myself on the ridge beam and wrenching my shoulder. When I finally got back inside, the cabin was filled with smoke, the fire was nearly out, and I was shaking uncontrollably from cold and adrenaline. I thought seriously about leaving right then, packing my gear, hiking out at first light, and calling the whole thing a failed experiment. But I was too exhausted to move. I collapsed on the floor near the stove, fed it until the smoke cleared, and fell asleep. The second setback was moisture. Despite the vapor barrier, despite the venting around the stove, despite every precaution I'd taken, moisture kept accumulating inside the cabin. It condensed on the window at night, froze into a layer of ice, and then melted during the day when the stove was running, dripping onto the floor. It formed frost on the interior walls wherever insulation was thin or missing. It soaked into the wood stove platform I'd built, warping the boards. And worst of all, it got into the rock wool insulation in the walls, reducing its effectiveness and creating cold spots. I tried everything: ventilation, dehumidifying with desiccants made from wood ash and salt, even opening the door periodically to let dry air in. But nothing worked completely. The moisture was a constant problem, and it made the cabin feel colder and damper than it should have been. Started to wonder if the stone wall, which I'd thought was helping, was actually making things worse by holding moisture in the thermal mass. But when I monitored the humidity levels, I realized the opposite was true. The stone wall was one of the driest surfaces in the cabin because it stayed warm enough that moisture didn't condense on it. The problem was everywhere else. The third setback was firewood. I'd stocked what I thought was enough dry wood for a month, but I was burning through it faster than expected. The stove was small and efficient, but keeping the stone wall charged required sustained heat, and that meant feeding the fire constantly. I started running out of dry wood and had to resort to cutting green spruce, which burned poorly and created excessive creosote in the flue. I knew that was dangerous. Creosote buildup leads to chimney fires, but I didn't have a choice. I spent 2 days in below-zero weather cutting, splitting, and stacking green wood under a tarp, hoping it would dry enough to burn cleanly. My hands were so cold I could barely feel the axe handle. My feet went numb inside my boots. And the whole time I kept thinking about how much easier it would be to just leave, to admit I'd pushed too hard, gambled too much on a marginal system, and walk away before something went seriously wrong. But I didn't. I kept cutting wood, I kept feeding the stove, and I kept believing the stone wall would pull me through. The turning point came during a cold snap in late January. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing it even lower. I'd never experienced cold like that. Every breath burned. The inside of my nose froze. The moisture in my beard turned to ice. Outside, the world was silent and brittle, the snow squeaking underfoot like styrofoam. Inside the cabin, the stone wall proved its worth. I kept the stove burning hot from late afternoon until midnight, charging the thermal mass as fully as I could. Then I let the fire die down to ash, crawled into my sleeping bag in the loft, and waited. At 2 in the morning, I woke up expecting to find the cabin frozen solid. Instead, it was around 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold, yes, but survivable without active heat. I climbed down and placed my hand on the stone wall. It was still warm, not hot, but warm enough to radiate noticeable heat into the space. The wall was giving back the energy it had stored hours earlier, and that slow release was keeping the cabin above freezing. I sat there in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside, feeling the warmth radiating from the stones, and I understood. The stone wall wasn't just a nice feature. It was the only reason the cabin worked. Without it, the thin insulation and leaky construction would have been overwhelmed by the cold. With it, I had a functional shelter. Over the next week, I tested the wall's limits. I experimented with different burn schedules, long, slow fires versus short, hot fires, banking coals versus letting the stove go cold, feeding it continuously versus intermittent burns. I found that the wall performed best with sustained moderate heat, rather than brief intense heat, because it needed time to absorb energy deep into the stone mass. I also discovered that positioning mattered. The stove needed to be close enough that radiant heat hit the wall directly, but not so close that it created hotspots that could crack the stones or damage the mortar. I settled on about 18 inches as the optimal distance, and I learned that the wall continued to release heat for up to 8 hours after the fire went out, tapering off slowly rather than dropping all at once. That slow taper made mornings tolerable, gave me time to restart the fire without freezing, and eliminated the panic of waking up in a freezing cabin. But the stone wall also taught me about trade-offs. It took up floor space I could have used for storage. It added weight that stressed the marginal foundation. It required hours of labor to build, labor I could have spent improving insulation or sealing drafts, and it demanded a specific burn schedule that limited my flexibility. If I let the fire go out too early, the wall didn't charge fully, and the cabin got cold overnight. If I burned too hot for too long, I wasted firewood and created excessive heat during the day. The system required attention, planning, and discipline. It wasn't a magic solution. It was a tool that worked only if I used it correctly. And that realization, that the wall's effectiveness depended entirely on my decisions and effort, was humbling. It reminded me that survival systems aren't about finding one perfect trick. They're about integrating multiple imperfect solutions into something that works well enough. The final test came in early February, when a storm dropped 2 feet of snow over 3 days. The temperature hovered around 0, the wind was relentless, and I was trapped inside the cabin with no choice but to trust the system I'd built. I kept the stove running as much as I could, fed it every piece of dry wood I had, and watched the stone wall do its job. During the worst of the storm, when the wind was strong enough to rattle the walls and I could feel cold air leaking in through gaps I couldn't seal, the stone wall kept the cabin warm enough that I never felt in danger. The temperature inside never dropped below 30 degrees, even when the fire went out for hours at a time. The wall stored heat during the day, released it at night, and created a buffer that gave me time to react if something went wrong. When the storm finally cleared and I could get outside to assess the damage, I realized the cabin had held together because of 2 things: the structural integrity of the frame and the thermal stability provided by the stone wall. Everything else was secondary. Looking back now, after 2 months in that cabin, I can say with certainty that the stone wall was the defining feature that made the project viable. It wasn't the insulation, though that helped. It wasn't the stove, though that was essential. It wasn't the roof, the door, or any of the other components I spent so much time on. It was the thermal mass of those stacked stones, charged with radiant heat from the stove, and releasing it slowly overnight, that kept me alive and kept me from abandoning the project. Without it, the cabin would have been too cold to occupy. With it, I had a marginal but functional shelter that taught me more about heat, materials, and survival than any book or video ever could. And if I were to do this again, if I were to build another winter cabin in another remote location, I would start with the stone wall. I would build it first, design everything else around it, and trust that the thermal mass would carry me through the coldest nights. Which brings me to the practical takeaways. First, thermal mass works, but it requires sustained heat input to charge and time to release. You can't expect instant results. Second, materials matter. Dense stone holds heat longer than light materials, and positioning the thermal mass behind the heat source maximizes radiant absorption. Third, a good system is a balanced system. The stone wall only worked because I combined it with decent insulation, a functional stove, and careful fire management. No single component would have succeeded alone. Fourth, expect failure and plan for it. I nearly quit multiple times because I didn't anticipate how hard the cold would make every task. Having backup plans, extra materials, and the mental resilience to push through setbacks is as important as any technical skill. And fifth, document everything. I recorded every decision, every mistake, every small victory, because I knew that even if the project failed, the lessons would be valuable. And they were. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with me through this entire story. I know it's long, but I wanted to give you the complete picture. Not just the highlights, but the struggles, the doubts, and the small victories that added up to something bigger. If you found this useful, or if you're planning your own off-grid build and want to avoid the mistakes I made, subscribe to the channel. I'll be sharing more detailed videos about the stone wall construction, the stove setup, and the other systems I tested this winter. And if you have questions or want me to cover specific topics, leave a comment and I'll do my best to answer. Building in winter is hard, but it's not impossible. You just need the right systems, the right mindset, and maybe a stone wall to keep you warm when everything else feels like it's falling apart. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.